This is part 3 of the PowerPoint on chapters 21 and 22. In the last video, we left off discussing Lamarck and his discovery or his theorizing that there was descent with modification occurring through time. But what he really believed, which was an error, was that the evolution of these different traits that were being observed were the result of the use and disuse of certain traits. For example, he believed that the long necks of giraffes resulted from generations of giraffes reaching for higher and higher leaves in a tree. And so that encouraged the preservation and passing down of this trait. The fact that there was a high level of use of this reaching motion. He thought that evolutionary change was driven by an innate drive of organisms to increase their complexity, which we now know is not true. Modern genetics has proven that there's no evidence that an acquired characteristic can be inherited or passed down. So again, using the example of a bodybuilder, by working out a lot and building bigger biceps, you're not necessarily going to, well, you aren't at all, going to be able to change the genes that are going to be then passed down through gametes to offspring. So moving on to part 2 in chapter 22 is the discussion of descent with modification according to Darwin. So in 1844, he wrote his essay on natural selection as a mechanism of descent with modification. But he actually didn't introduce that theory publicly. He did believe that natural selection is a process in which individuals with favorable inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, and in that way pass down that trait. But it wasn't until 1858 when he received a manuscript from Alfred Wallace, who was developing a theory of natural selection that was similar to Darwin's, that Darwin got inspired to quickly finish his Origin of Species and get it published the next year. He was a British naturalist, and he is most famous, of course, for that Origin of Species. But the way he actually developed that theory was through the clear and careful collection of evidence to support his ideas. The way that he went about collecting his evidence was during his voyage on the Beagle. And he made a lot of ecological and geological observations, but a lot of his theory actually is founded on the vast collection of specimens that he amassed while he was traveling. This is a picture of a crab that's being held. It's one of the original specimens that Darwin did collect on that journey. And you can find these specimens in various museums. There's a large collection at Oxford University in England in their Natural History Museum, and you can actually see a lot of these specimens online. But basically, he collected specimens of South American plants and animals, and he observed during that time that fossils resembled living species from the same region, and that living species resembled other species from nearby regions. So he was a very careful and good observer of different trends as he was traveling. During his visit to Chile, there was an earthquake that lifted up rocks and revealed different strata of rocks. And he was heavily influenced by Lyell's Principles of Geology. And through this experience and with that background, he believed or came to believe that the Earth was a lot more than the 6,000 years old that was currently believed to be the Earth's lifespan at the time. This is a picture showing the travels of the Beagle. It didn't just travel in South America, but you can see there was a lot of ocean that was covered, and a lot of places where Darwin could make his observations and make the collections. So his interest in geographic distribution of species was kindled by a stop at the Galapagos Islands, which is west of South America. And there he observed and recorded the rich variety of plant and animal life, and he found a significant evidence for his ideas on variation as he observed the birds and tortoises that were there, and those birds and tortoises became the subjects of some of his most famous studies. He hypothesized that species from South America had colonized the Galapagos and became new species on those islands. His conclusions when he returned were these four: that parents pass on characters to their offspring, that there's variation between individuals within populations of a species, that there are limited resources available to support populations, and that new species arise as a result of what he termed natural selection acting on those populations. This is a short video showing a marine iguana, so this would have been typical of an observation that Darwin made. He perceived that adaptation to the environment and the origin of a new species were closely related processes. And since Darwin's voyage, biologists have concluded that this is what happened to the Galapagos finches. It's like he's smiling at you. So these are three examples of the beak variation among finches in the Galapagos. So how did those come about? According to Darwin's theory, is that it's related to the food source for each of these types of finches and species. And there's three basic types. There's seed eaters, flower eaters, or insect eaters. So rapid speciation is the new species filling a new niche because they inherit successful adaptations. This is the idea of adaptive radiation, which is the process in which organisms diversify in terms of making new species rapidly into a multitude of new forms in response to a change in the environment that makes new resources available or creates new challenges and opens an environmental niche. This next picture shows again the different types of beaks that are found in Darwin's finches and how those are associated with eating different foods. So the survival and reproduction of a beneficial adaptation to food being available on the islands is what is responsible for new speciation. Darwin explained three broad observations in his Origin of Species. One is that there's unity of life, two, that there's diversity of life, and three, that there's a match between organisms and their environments. He never used the word evolution in his first edition of the Origin of Species. Instead, he used the phrase descent with modification, which summarized his perception of the unity of life. The unity of life refers to a view that all organisms